Hello everybody, welcome back to a brand new video. Welcome back to the Prime Minister Timeline, Episode 9, where we will be going through the years of 1956 to 1976. So let's go ahead and jump straight into it, with the first year being 1956. The only major event that happens here is the federal election that happens in 1956, where progressives are once again taking power. And you'll see throughout these 2 decades that it's a very progressive time in the United States, as the country is actually moving in a way similar to how Canada did during this time, so we are moving in a more liberal direction. But in the 1956 federal election, the Progressives under Estes Kefauver, they gained 2 seats. The Republicans under John Bricker, they lose 2 seats, and the Federalists under Averell Harriman, they don't lose or gain any seats. This is also a time for the Federalists of they're kind of stuck right now. You'll never see them have less than 20 seats, but they'll barely get over 22, or they'll barely get over 20. They're always stuck around that 20 mark during this time, and I could imagine their seats are very spread out. Like, there could be an election where they lose 10 of the seats they had the previous Congress, but they gain 10 seats in other areas of the country. Really just depends on the election and what's happened, and as well as the candidates. Heading on to 1957, Prime Minister Kefauver signs an executive order deeming the KKK domestic terrorist organization, taking a very progressive approach to the whole civil rights thing. And as we saw with Earl Warren, where he was taking a very progressive and regressive approach to the KKK, Estes Kefauver would continue to do the same thing, just a bit more aggressive in the process. So the race riots I will see throughout these 2 decades are very much federal troops versus state troops, who are also trying to take out, civil rights protesters. Which, 9 times out of 10, the civil rights protesters are being very, very peaceful, from what I've read. Of course, I could be wrong. Also, I am being a bit quieter than normal because it is 7:20 in the morning and I'm the only one awake in my house. I don't want to, wake anyone up. Also, I've been up since 4 o'clock in the morning working on this. Someone help me, please. Please. Next, Prime Minister Kefauver does sign a Civil Rights Act. He signs the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which is the federal integration of, it allows the federal government to forcefully integrate, minorities into communities like schools and such. So, the federal mandate of busing, that's here. So the Civil Rights Act 1957 really didn't have that much. It really only established a commission on civil rights. This one is a lot more stronger. Speaking of the Commission of Civil Rights, that is still a thing here. Also, we do have the second Red Scare ending. Progressives, I would imagine the Republicans and Federalists, for some reason I want to say the Federalists were more, trying to get the Red Scare going, but it failed tremendously in this timeline. Going on to 1958, we see high unemployment throughout the year. Of course, that goes back down into normal levels around the beginning of 1959. As well as in 1958, we have the US and the UK signing a mutual defense agreement. So if one of us is attacked, the other one is opted to help them out, whether that's physically or with aid. That's what that, agreement is all about. Going on to 1958, Alaska and Hawaii are both granted statehood. This is something that happened to IRL, and I would imagine Alaska would be a lot more of a progressive state going forward. Not really because of a progressive prime minister giving them statehood. It's more the fact that progressives have a lot more control over the country than they did in the real timeline. In 1960, the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security between the US and Japan is signed. So this is pretty much bringing back an alliance between the two countries that, went to war with each other in World War II, where Japan got the shit bombed out of them, so on and so forth. Also, Kefauver does not enter Vietnam, so no prime minister going forward will enter Vietnam, and the big debate going forward is should the U.S. have gotten involved in Vietnam, as Vietnam becomes a communist state. So Vietnam isn't really this mishmash of the two, but still not being split like Korea was. It's just a communist country, straightforward. You might have heard those words from an alternate history of video. I think RF knows if JFK survived. I think. Don't quote me on that. Prime Minister Kefauver also signed the Civil Rights Act of 1960, which is the federal inspection of voter polls. Eisenhower did this IRL, we might see something similar with Kefauver as well. Heading on to 1960, the federal election here, the progressives end up losing seats. They're now at 228, losing 21. The Republicans under Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., they gain 22 seats, 186. And the Federalists under Lyndon B. Johnson, they lose 1 seat, 21 seats in total. Heading towards 1961, Prime Minister Kefauver announces that the U.S. has cut diplomatic ties with Cuba, so we would still not have a good relationship with Cuba. However, Kefauver would handle a certain situation with Cuba a lot better, yet similarly to Kennedy did. We'll get to that in a second. But also, Prime Minister Kefauver would do what Kennedy does and establish the Peace Corps, and we would also have race riots, as explained earlier. It's just this big mishmash of civil rights protesters versus state troopers versus Federalist troops. Or not Federalist, but Federal. Heading into 1962, we do have Kefauver launching a trade embargo against Cuba. That still occurs. Also, the Cuban Missile Crisis would still happen. Now, the thing with Kefauver and the Cuban Missile Crisis, we'll probably see Kefauver do everything he can to diplomatically get the situation under control. Unlike Kennedy, he would be a lot more open to the public about what the hell is going on in a way that would not cause panic. Kennedy was, spoke about it, but he didn't speak about it in a way that gave us a lot of details, right? At least that's what I'm remembering. Kefauver would probably get, the whole situation dealt with in roughly the same amount of time, but at the same time, the Soviet Union would probably take their weapons out due to the diplomatic negotiations of Kefauver and his cabinet, going on with the whole openness of the public of what's going on. There's more of a public trust in the U.S. government due to Kefauver. So nowadays, in the modern day, you would see, the U.S. folk, the citizens, more trusting of the government. Of course, we still haven't gotten to 2001 yet and the whole Patriot Act, so we'll just have to wait and see. But going on 1963, sad news is that Estes Kefauver would still pass away. He passed away in 1963, and so he would still do the same here. His big shining moment as Prime Minister would be his negotiations of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thus, his Deputy Prime Minister Hubert Humphrey would succeed him as Prime Minister, and he was running for Prime Minister anyway, so this just works out. And since there is a federal election next year, they don't hold one in 63. Zip codes are introduced in the U.S., so if you ever, for some reason, wondered why zip codes are a thing and when they happened, it was July 1st, 1963. You're welcome. Also, Prime Minister Humphrey signs the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was signed by a bunch of UN countries to be like, hey, can we stop testing out these nuclear weapons? Thanks. Heading on to 1964, Prime Minister Humphrey would sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This abolishes segregation straightforward. This is the same bill, maybe a bit more progressive than the one Johnson signed. More race rights occur. The 15th Amendment is ratified, which is a poll tax ban. If you remember this timeline, it's a lot harder to amend the Constitution. That's why there's only 15 amendments by now. And the 15th Amendment in this timeline is what we would call the 24th Amendment. We also have the 1964 federal election, which sees progressives do big wins, big gains, with 37 seats of a net gain, giving them 265 seats. Republicans under Barry Goldwater, 150 seats, they lose 36, and the Federalists under William Miller, they have 20 seats, losing 1. Now, you could, credit the progressives' big win to several factors, one being the death of Kefauver, another one being Barry Goldwater, and, not being that great of a party leader as he was as a nominee for the Republicans in 1964 in real life. Really, you could chalk it up to a bunch of things. Heading towards 1965, we do have the Bloody Sunday riot. This is something I haven't mentioned previously because I didn't think it was that big of a deal. This timeline, it is because it's a lot more brutal. As it was, if you don't know what Bloody Sunday was, it was like 10,000 state troopers beating the hell out of like 400, 500 civil rights protesters. Now, think of that, but now we're sending in like federal troops or just, officers who are being sent in by the federal government to, quell, one, the state troopers doing what they're doing, and one, get things back under control. So it would be a lot more brutal, and, some people, you might say this is kind of like a pseudo-civil war, but again, it really wasn't like, this whole, we'll secede, or we want a new government where black folk don't get rights. It really wasn't anything like that. Of course, you still get like major segregationists like George Wallace and Lester Maddox being elected governors in their state, but their influence isn't as strong. Also, Prime Minister Humphrey does sign the Civil Rights Act in 1965 because of the Bloody Sunday riots, which prohibits voting discrimination. Prime Minister Humphrey would also sign the Voting Rights Act in 1965, same bill as Johnson, maybe a bit more progressive. It bans literacy tests. Prime Minister Humphrey signs the legislation ending quotas based on national origin if you want to immigrate to this country. Before this, if you wanted to immigrate to this country, there was like this big-ass waiting list. And depending on where you were from, you would have you would either go to the top of the list or the bottom of the list, depending on where you were from. And it was like, if you were Chinese or whatever, you would go directly to the bottom of the list. That's typically what would happen. In 1966, there's nothing noteworthy. 1967, more race rights. Note the 25th Amendment is not ratified, so it has not become the 16th Amendment. So the whole Presidential Succession Amendment isn't a thing. We haven't really had a need for it. In 1968, we go into that federal election where progressives end up winning 260 seats, losing 5 under Hubert Humphrey. Republicans under Spiro Agnew win 155 seats, gaining 5. And the Federalists under George Romney have 20 seats. They don't win or lose anything. And Humphrey is re-elected prime minister with a majority government once more. Man, I remember started making this. I was like, man, are we getting into a minority government for the first time in so long? And of course, we didn't, because certain things happened. Going on in 1969, Prime Minister Humphrey signs Universal Health Care Bill. This was something that was, picking up steam around the late 60s, early 70s. And with a progressive prime minister like Hubert Humphrey, it would actually get done. There's little stopping Hubert Humphrey and the progressives getting this bill passed. So again, we're moving in a direction similar to Canada was in this time. So as we have a single-payer healthcare system in the United States. Also, bigger news, the first man on the moon occurs. One small step for man, one large step for mankind. Huge news. We win the space race. 1970, there's nothing noteworthy. 1971, Prime Minister Humphrey passes the Special Education Bill, so he's pretty much establishing the nationwide usage of special education for those who need insert words that don't make me look like asshole. 1972, the 16th Amendment is ratified, this one being a amendment that is not, an amendment IRL, that being the Equal Rights Amendment. So when this thing was when the ERA was first put forward, since the progressives have such a large share of seats in, Congress, I don't remember if I was calling this the U.S. Congress or the U.S. Parliament. I think Congress. And, I can guarantee you some left-wing Federalists would also support the bill. It would be pretty easy to imagine the ERA getting passed and becoming the 16th Amendment. Also, the 1972 federal election, the progressives under George McGovern, they win 247 seats, losing 13. Republicans under John Ashbrook, who's a lot more liberal compared to the past Republican leaders, they win 167 seats, winning 12. And the Federalists under John Lindsay from New York City, they win 21 seats, gaining 1. The first time in a long time they've gained seats, even if it's just 1. And George McGovern is elected prime minister. The second series that I've done with him being elected as prime minister or president. Good times, good times. Hitting off the 1973, the oil and energy crisis begins. So the oil crisis, that ends early 1974, but the energy crisis is still going to be a thing well into the 80s, so McGovern's got that to worry about. In 1974, U.S. and Egypt reestablished diplomatic relations, which helps out with the U.S. and their oil crisis, since Egypt is a good chunk of our supply of oil around this time. 1975, there's nothing noteworthy. In 1976, Prime Minister McGovern signs campaign finance reform. Gerald Ford signed something similar to this. I don't remember what the bill was called. However, it was very mush. It barely restricted any sort of campaign funding, I guess you could say. So McGovern would probably pass something you would see in the modern day right here, which, big influence, huge influence. Also, there's a high poverty rate in 1976. It's mostly among minorities such as Hispanics and blacks, but it still causes the poverty rate to be higher than it needs to be anyway. Heading on to the 1976 federal election, progressives winning 248 seats, that's a net gain of 1, and the Republicans under Bob Dole, they win 166 seats, losing 1, and the Federalists under Gerald Ford win 21 seats, not gaining or losing anything. George McGovern is re-elected prime minister with a majority government despite, all these problems he's had, and he really hasn't had that much of an eventful prime ministership, but still he's re-elected to a second term. So, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. This is the Chaotic One saying, peace.